Welcome to this walk through Philippians 1 verses 21 to 24. Our sentences for this session are not smooth. Lightfoot suggests that the grammar of the passage reflects the conflict of feeling in the apostle's mind. He's tossed to and fro between the desire to labor for Christ in life and the desire to be united with Christ by death. The abrupt and disjointed sentences express this hesitation. And Hellerman, in his B&H volume, notes that this is an example of a rhetorical device called synkrisis that's used for comparisons and evaluations. That's page 65 in Hellerman. So let's begin through the text. Emoigar to zein Christos. Well, in the previous sentence, Paul has said that his eager expectation and hope is that Christ will be magnified in his body, whether through life or death. And so we have Gar here, letting us know that now he's explaining the grounds for that expectation and hope. And that grounds is that his whole life is focused on Christ and bound up with him. Emoi, the dative of reference as far as I'm concerned, that kind of idea. Its form here is emphatic because you have the epsilon on the front and also the position. Now, the context is referred to preachers who proclaim Christ in an impure way. And so Paul may intend to contrast with them. But then what he's saying about himself is true in any and all circumstances, so it's not necessarily just limited to this context in that case. To zein. Here we got an article, and zein is an infinitive, a present active infinitive. And we need to talk about this form a bit. Zein is said to come from zao, and that verb is often presented in basic Greek as an alpha contract verb. And its forms in the present indicative match what you'd expect in an alpha contract verb. But the present infinitive ending is n, which is then usually contracted with an epsilon linking vowel and shows up as ain. So you probably learned ain as your infinitive ending. But in an alpha contract verb, that n is going to contract with the alpha to produce on. So you get agapao, the n for the infinitive would be agapan. So the present infinitive of zao should be zan instead of zein. So in fact, despite what you learned in basic Greek, this is not from zao, and you see that the concise Danker lexicon, CGL, puts it pretty bluntly. This forms an invention of grammarians, see zo. And you go over to zo, and he explains it's a contract of the epic form zoo via the Attic form zo, with ze forms being secondary. So it's a somewhat complicated verb, as you can see. Basically, the Attic Greek is using eta in its forms, and that's what we have in zein, our infinitive in our passage. So to zein here is going to serve as the subject of the sentence, and Christos is going to be our subject complement, or what others call a predicate nominative. And the verb to be has been left out, so we have a predicate position. So as far as I'm concerned, or for me, or in my case, at least for me, to live is Christ. Now Lightfoot translates to zein Christos as life is Christ. Here's Lightfoot's take on what this means. I live only to serve him, only to commune with him. I have no conception of life apart from him. So that's Lightfoot's understanding of what Paul means by to live as Christ. But some recent commentators want to limit the reference to Paul's ongoing physical life. And you can see Hellerman talking about that option, page 65. And that would take into account the next clause that refers to death, and then also the reference to living in the flesh in verse 22. So there are some things in the context to take into account, but I think Lightfoot's interpretation is the better one. I think what Paul is doing here in this first statement is a comprehensive foundational statement which grounds his view of his life in the flesh and its cessation. And also the same thing goes for limiting this assertion to mission opportunities. Again, Hellerman, page 66, goes into some of those views among the commentators. And again, I think Lightfoot's more comprehensive view is preferable here. I think it makes more sense that Paul is giving a comprehensive statement here at the outset that then grounds the particular focus in this passage in different ways. his fundamental disposition is life itself is Christ. Christ is his whole life. And so Lightfoot's quote that I gave you earlier, I think, is beautiful and accurate. So our next clause, we have the same grammatical construction. Kai ta apothenein kerdos. We have an infinitive, ta apothenein, and kerdos then will be our subject complement, and again the verb to be left out. And to die is gain. Notice the difference in these infinitives, a present infinitive versus an aorist infinitive. So we can compare the verbal aspect of them. Zain in the present with the imperfective aspect. We'll view an action in progress in some sense. And then the aorist infinitive, apothenein, second aorist infinitive. It's a perfective aspect, viewing the action as a whole. So Paul's not saying the process of dying is gain, but dying viewed as a whole, the completed act of dying. Now, most people, of course, view death as a great loss, not a gain. But for Paul, it represents coming closer to Christ, who is his life. So death itself has been transformed into something beneficial for those whose life is hid with Christ in God, as Paul puts it over in Colossians 3. So grounded in Christ, with one's life in God with Christ, then death itself is merely a transition to a new form of the one life that is consistent throughout. Because if Christ is your life, he's there whether you're alive in this world or in the next world. That's your balance. That's your point of stability. That's your point of identity. And that remains firm whether you're here or there. And by going to Christ through death, you're coming closer to him, and so it's gain. Next clause. Eide todzein in sarki. So after saying death is gain, he now contrasts that with the alternative possibility of remaining alive using this first class condition A. And again, the verb to be is elided. But if I am to live in the flesh, be how we could get that into English. And again, the present aspect here has the idea if I'm to go on living in the flesh. And the first class condition has this sense, and let's assume that I am. So assuming that I'm going to keep living in the flesh, to ta moi karpos ergu. This, for me, fruit of work. Very wooden there. The apodosis is another clause with an elided verb. I haven't got many verbs to work with so far. And the tuta then is referring back to the infinitive, ta zain, this ongoing life. This ongoing life then, here we have a dative of advantage. For me, is the karpos, subject complement now. So this ongoing life is for me fruit of work. So the big question here is how's this genitive ergu functioning? It could be epexegetic, fruit, i.e. work, or the attributed genitive, fruitful work, where the head term becomes like the adjective, fruitful work, or source. And that's the approach I think that's most helpful, and that's what BDAG takes. So let's take a look at BDAG. Here under karpos, number 2, he gives the gloss advantage or gain or profit, and then our particular passage would be gain from the labor. So you see from the labor, he's taking that ergu as source. So taking that option that BDAG has given us, then we would have a clear contrast here between death being gain and then this fruit or this gain. We have two kinds of gain, in other words, if karpos has that essential idea. So Paul's own personal gain from growing closer to Jesus by dying, and then we've got the gain from the labor for Christ. In other words, the gain in the lives of these people whom he loves. So it's a gain for Paul to be closer to Christ versus this gain of that comes from the labor, which would be the fruit in their lives. Kaiti hairesomai u genorizo, and which I shall choose, I do not know. And finally, we get some verbs to work with. Ti hieresemai, an indirect question. That's why I've got it in parentheses here to separate it out like that. But it's serving as the content of gnorizo, like a direct object. Now, since both of these options are a form of gain for Paul, he doesn't know which one he should choose. The idea choose may give the wrong impression here, as if Paul is including the option of suicide, which was an option in some systems of thought in his day, though not in Judaism. Both the large Whitacre lexicon, BDAG, and the concise CGEL suggest instead of choose that we go with prefer here. And prefer may work, but choose is a bit stronger and it may be better here. As Hellerman notes on page 68, the word hiereo is used in secular Greek and the Septuagint to take into one's hand, to seize. In the New Testament, only the middle is used, and so the idea is to take for oneself, means to choose. So Paul would not see himself as choosing whether to commit suicide or not, but rather the more general idea. Which option will he take to himself and hold on to? The desire to depart and be with the Lord, or to remain and be of service? So those are his options, and what does he say? Sunechomai de ekton duo. So sunechomai, let's look at that. It means to hold together, and then in the sense of surround or confine or enclose. And BDAG number 5, to cause distress by force of circumstance. Seize, attack, distress, torment. And here for our passage, Whitacre says, the apostle, torn between conflicting emotions, says, I'm hard-pressed to choose between the two. So that translation gets it nicely, hard-pressed, having that idea of being constrained or surrounded. Has that same kind of flavor to it. So I'm hard-pressed from the two, in other words, between these two options. Now I've got square brackets around this next bit because we've got a circumstantial participle here, or adverbial participle. Tein epithemion echon eista analusai kai sun Christo enai. And I've got the angle brackets here because we've got some infinitives within this participial cluster. Echon, the circumstantial participle, probably causal. I'm hard-pressed because I have the desire, having the desire. Because I have the desire, since I have the desire. Epithemia with ace means a desire for something. That's BDAG 1b. So I'm having this desire for ace. Analusai, aorist active infinitive from analuo. You remember luo, to loose. Well, here's to loose or untie, or in the sense of depart. So having the desire to depart and with Christ to be. Enai, the infinitive from eimi. Now, Hellerman simply affirms on page 69 that eis ta analusai is an epexegetic infinitive. In other words, this infinitive is explaining the epithumia. What's the content, or what sort of desire are we talking about? But Varner, in the Baylor series, goes into a little bit more detail and notes that Wallace calls such a use rare. That's Wallace, page 611. And Blasterbrunner Funk calls this a free use. That's BDF paragraph 404.4. And so is it some kind of rare construction or a loose construction? I think a lot more straightforward approach is to see these infinitives as simply nouns, and this is simply a prepositional phrase. These are analusai and enai are simply the objects of the preposition. So a literal translation would be something like having the desire for departing and being with Christ. So normally when you see eis ta with an infinitive, you start thinking about changing this into a clause in English and putting an accusative as the subject of the infinitive. But there is no accusative here. And in fact, even in those constructions, it's just simply a prepositional phrase in Greek. So here's a little explanation of that. And let's look at our example down here. Kyria katabethi. prin apothanein ta paidion mu. So Lord, come down before dying with reference to my child, is literally how a Greek would understand this. They're not changing this into a clause or something. It's just simply a prepositional phrase. Or here's another one, pra tu me pathain, before this suffering with reference to me. These accusatives are accusatives of reference, not subjects. We change them into subjects in English because we don't have this construction, so we have to change this around into a clause to get it into good English. But in Greek, this is just simply a prepositional phrase with an infinitive noun as our object of the preposition, and then an accusative of reference telling us who is doing the verbal idea of the infinitive. So what we have here is just simply a prepositional phrase. Having the desire to, or for, to be the loosing, to departing, and being with Christ. And notice we've got a TSKS. We've got one article with these two nominal infinitives. So that's packaging this whole thing here of the departure and the being with Christ as two sides of the coin of this desire that Paul has. In other words, both the transition event of the departing and the new state that will come from that, being with Christ. So the transition event is only desirable because of the resulting new state. But the new state requires passing through the transition event. So together they form the desire. And Paul says, Paulo gar malon kreson. So paulo from palus pale palu, much or many. So we have a dative of measure here, by much. And malon is an adverb, meaning more. And kreson is the comparative of agathos, better. Here's the bit in Abbott Smith about kreson. It's an epic form in the old Attic form. The double tau in the later Attic. And that's very common. You have double tau in the classical Greek, ends up double sigma in Hellenistic Greek. So properly the comparative of kratus, strong, but in sense often, as in classical Greek, comparative of agathos. So very woodenly, better by much, by much more. Better by much more. We could supply a subject and a verb if you want to smooth it out a bit. Something like this is far better. But rhetorically it works just the way it is. We could say something like having the desire to depart and be with Christ. Better by far. See, if we don't add in elided verbs to get smoother English, we can often find rhetorically very punchy expressions in the Greek. They don't always work in the English, but that's part of the power of the Greek language coming through here. And then verse 24. Another bracketed thing because we've got it here in this case this infinitive. Ta de epimenein in te sarki anankairateron di humos. Hellerman says the de here indicates a new sentence, but de doesn't always initiate a new sentence, and so it's not necessarily the case here. For an example of that, see Ephesians 4 verses 20 to 24, which is one sentence in the Greek, but with de right in the middle of it. So if you're interested in checking that out, that's one of the examples I use in using and enjoying biblical Greek on pages 86 and 87. So our sentence ends with yet another clause with an equitive verb missing. That's been typical all the way through here, which is part of why Lightfoot made that comment at the outset. Ta epimenein is the subject, and then anankairateron is our subject complement. Anankaios means necessary, and so then we add the comparative adjective morpheme teros on to get our form, so more necessary. So we have something like, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary because of you, or for your sakes. Now the next sentence is going to indicate that this necessity is the determining factor in Paul's choice. What he's saying right here, it's necessary for you guys. That's going to be tipping the balance here in his trying to figure out which he should choose. This whole sentence that we've looked at is showing Paul torn between pleasing himself and serving others. And so his decision is going to model the Christ hymn in chapter 2. Paul, for whom life is Christ, shares in the mind of Christ, who humbled himself and emptied himself in obedience to the Father for the sake of others.